Yeah. Whew. All right.
Okay.
I think this is the hard part. Now we move forward. Well, yeah, welcome everybody. I am here to talk a little bit about trauma and the trauma that refugee kids carry with them and bring with them as a result of their experiences. Um, So when today we are going to talk about trauma and trauma response, what does trauma look like in children? We'll explore the symptoms of trauma and how can we tell when someone is experiencing trauma symptoms or even like triggers. We are going to look at intergenerational trauma, attachment issues, how do we create safety and trust, and how do we take care of our caregivers, because those are also the people that are doing the work every single day, and caring for them is very important. So to define trauma, so it's trauma is like an experience, right? An overwhelming experience of that cause somebody a distress and they have difficulty coping with it. So it's beyond the person's brain, the brain's capacity to actually manage that trauma. So when you think of trauma, I want you to think of a wound, right? Like it is literally the word trauma means a wound or an injury. The only difference is it is an invisible injury. Nobody can see it or feel it but you. So when we're looking at refugee children in general and refugees in general, all of them, I guess, adults or child, are vulnerable to experiencing trauma in different stages of their lives. So a lot of them might experience it before their migration, maybe when they were children at home. And then there's also during the migration. And a lot of us seen some of the things that could happen or happen during that, migration, including assault and rape and death, witnessing death and horrible, horrible things. And then you would think once they get out of that stressful environment and they come to their hosting country, or like they make it here, you would hope that like that trauma journey has ended. But sometimes there are post migration trauma, especially with kids. They struggle with like adjustment issues, language issues, bullying, especially in middle school and high school. We see a lot of bullying. um, all that again contributes to the symptoms that they might experience. I do want to say that everyone who experiences trauma does not necessarily mean they get traumatized, right? Like there are people who are able to heal, with time on their own without any additional support or treatment. So we look at what are some of the protective factors, right? Like why do some people get traumatized and become very symptomatic to the point where they need intervention, and some people manage it on their own and they are fine. And the reason for that is some of the protective factors that help a person heal from it on their own. So some of that could include support system that a person has. Support system plays a big role in a person's life. So do I have people that are able to hold space for me when I'm suffering, when I'm struggling? So I want to give you like an example of when let's say a child, right? In other countries, the other part of the world, right? Child discipline sometimes can be severe. So what we would look at here as a child abuse, a lot of it is looked at as a child discipline. So let's say a child get hit with a belt by their father because of whatever he did. And the child comes to mom and says, Mom, dad hit me, that's not okay. And mom says, well, had you not done that, you wouldn't be hit. What message is that sending to the child? That you're bad. You did a bad behavior and you got a consequences for it, right? Basically, you deserve this, is what they hearing. That's not holding a space. That's invalidating a child's pain. So when we invalidate the child's pain, then they start questioning and saying, oh, I must be a bad person because I deserve to be, you know, in trouble, to be hit, to be this and that. And that actually, that one statement that mom might have said makes that child more vulnerable to having symptoms of trauma. So as an adult, that child, if he or she experiences another incident where they felt like mistreated, violated, you know, injustice, they can regress back to that child self who that the child could go back to like, oh, I'm bad. I deserve this, right? Like bad things happen to me because I am bad. So support system can help one to heal or have more symptoms of depression and anxiety. Other things that could be that act as a protective factors is again like, is this a one-time trauma? Do they have a long other history of traumatic experiences? We look at faith sometimes can be a grounding aspect for somebody, you know. So an example of that would be like when we see the genocide that's happening in Gaza, right? And people are still saying, Alhamdulillah, you know, praise Allah, like everything that comes from Allah is good. So people who think when bad things are happening to us, there is a purpose behind it, and Allah has a bigger purpose. Those people tend to manage things a little bit better and tend to be content with uh, their um, their experiences. And again, like right, with every difficulty comes ease. So that's in the Quran. And people who believe in that tend to be a little bit more grounded and able to navigate stressful situations a little bit better. So what I want you to always kind of remember is trauma is not just what happened to us, right? And in our environment, but it also like what happened within us, what actually has changed within us as a result of the experience that we just experienced or whatever that we just witnessed. So when we talk about trauma, there are three types of trauma. There is acute trauma, which is a one-time trauma that could be like a car accident or a natural disaster or a physical assault. And then complex trauma, which is a prolonged trauma during childhood. So somebody experiencing multiple trauma or trauma like lasting for many years as a child, and then as like now when they come for services, I guess they are not experiencing the trauma directly, but they are suffering from the symptoms of that complex trauma. And then the chronic trauma is a prolonged trauma, like a war, domestic violence, right? Where a person might still be in that relationship or in that environment and experiencing it in a daily basis. Again, another good example for the chronic trauma would be what's happening in Gaza, right? Where we have some of the children who were born, like they opened their eyes and witnessed the occupation and the genocide and everything, and now they are adults and they probably experiencing and living it every single day. So that's what we would call a chronic trauma. So something that we see a lot is, well, with youth and refugees, we see complex trauma. So these are people who had some difficult times and distressful experiences, and then they are here now. It's not uncommon for refugees when they come to a safe place, right? When they come to safe place, the symptoms show up because when they were in the mix of the chaos and the stressful environment, they were in a survival mode. When you are in that autopilot, you're not processing anything. You're not thinking, oh, how am I feeling this moment, right? Like they don't say, we're just getting through the day and trying to survive that day. But when they make it here, and things slow down a little bit, that's when processing happens, when emotions resurface. That's when they start having flashbacks and nightmares of what happened, because when they were at that chaotic space, they were not able to think that way. I want to give you a quick example of a young man that I was working with recently. And by the time he got to me, he was an adult. Well, by the time he came to America, he was an adult, but he was a minor and unaccompanied for about 10 years in a refugee camp, him and his siblings. And by the time he got to us here, they came in December. They were put in a two-bedroom apartment, four of them, and a couple of weeks later he started showing symptoms, right? Like an anxiety, suspiciousness, being just irritated and not getting along with his siblings. And when the siblings were asked what is going on with him, is he always like, was he like that? They said no, he wasn't like that. But they also said, well, most of the time he was just, walking the streets. Like he was just out and about, and he would come home at the end of the day and just sleep. So we've never seen him cause any problems like this for us. Well, that was his coping skills, right? He was out and about, just wandering the streets all day, wearing himself out, and then coming home and sleeping. So the siblings never been like spent that much time in that close proximity with him. And when he was forced to sit down in a new country where it's snow everywhere during the holidays, he felt stuck. He just felt like he couldn't manage. Like he lost his coping skill. And that's when the symptoms showed up, and that's when he started becoming aggressive and eventually assaulted one of his brothers. And like it just got bad from there. And he definitely had to be medicated, and like a lot of things had to happen to get him to stability, but that's not uncommon, and we see a lot of that with refugees. So with all that happening, right, with the amount of stress that refugee youth are dealing with in general, um, your brain has to be impacted somehow. Like there's no way the brain is not going to be affected with everything that they are experiencing. So the amygdala is the part of the brain that's wired for survival. So if you heard about fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, these are the trauma responses that the amygdala says, all right, it's time to run, right? Or it's time to fight when the amygdala senses fear or lack of safety. And then we have our prefrontal cortex, which is the part of the brain that manages emotions, regulates emotions, and does our rational thinking for us. So that part is the doesn't actually develop fully until like late 20s. So we're talking about 24 and 26, between 24 and 26 is when it's fully developed. So depending on the child and their age, and how much stress and trauma they are exposed to, that actually like will have an impact on the development of that frontal cortex. And when there's so much trauma happening all the time, the frontal cortex, the prefrontal cortex is not able to process things very quickly. It's not able to respond to the amygdala and say, hey, let's slow down. Like, is this a real threat, or is this a trigger, right? Because that's what the prefrontal cortex does. It's like pushes back and says, okay, is this actually a threat, or is this a trigger? And let's differentiate that, and let's be rational about this. So the prefrontal cortex will not able to do that when the stress is too high, and then the amygdala will have more symptoms of PTSD as a result. And then, of course, the hippocampus, which is the part of the brain that controls memory, that also shrinks during stressful experiences. So while you have that in mind, we also have to be mindful of intergenerational trauma, because that's something that I feel like we don't think about a lot. But intergenerational trauma is the transmission of trauma from one generation to another without directly being impacted uh, the event or the experience. So what that means is that trauma actually can go through like the family line. So grandparents have the ability to transfer their unresolved experiences or traumatic experiences to their children. I really do like this infographic here because this is actually something that we see a lot with the college kids too, especially like the college kids of immigrant. Well, we see it in general actually with the general population, but I also see it more in with my clients in private practice. So here we have a grandma with a baby and the grandpa saying, you know, I can't do this anymore. I'm out. So he kind of leaves the relationship. And then grandma raises the daughter and then says, your father left us. He doesn't care. So that little girl is receiving messages of like, your father left us. He doesn't care about us, right? And then there's an anxiety that comes with that. The girl grows up and then she has a child, another girl, and she tells the girl, her daughter, she says, don't trust anybody, right? Like, or don't trust anyone, like nobody cares about you. So she's transferring that and anxiety to that child. And then the child grows up and says, I don't need anyone. I'm fine alone, right? So she's becoming very protective of herself. And the only way that she sees, um, way that she sees that she can protect herself is by saying, I'm fine alone. I don't need anybody, right? Which we'll get into that when we talk a little bit about attachment. So with that, it's really important to know what trauma symptoms look like. What am I really looking for when I have a child, a teenager, or even an adult in my life that might be struggling with some trauma symptoms? And the things that we look for is intrusive memories. We look for people who are avoiding triggers. So example of that was one of the clients I worked with had experienced a big like a fight or a family conflict at early age around 4, and as she got older, anytime she hears that loud noises or men yelling at each other, she automatically assumes that it's something is it's gonna get worse, and then she has the urge to leave that space. So that's an example of a trigger and someone trying to avoid the triggers. Negative thoughts, beliefs of like, I'm not good enough, I deserve to be hurt, or I deserve to bad things to happen to me, or God's punishing me because I am not good. Like all those are negative thoughts that can be intrusive. Being on guard, like the person that we just saw on the image in the previous image, it's like, I'm gonna protect myself. Um, so something to think about also, or just to remember that mental health is not something that is very that people are just like know of. Like when we talk about refugees, depending on where the person came from and their experiences, mental health is not in our frontal cortex, I guess. We don't think about it so much. So when we and it's easier for some refugees to identify with like physical symptoms than actual mental health symptoms, because again, we don't pay attention to emotions. Depending on the culture, some cultures are not very emotionally focused. So a lot of times though, when mental health is not treated, it manifests as a physical health issue. So then I've worked with a lot of people who will complain about physical health issues, but there is no evidence to support that they have any physical health problem. So the medical doctors have cleared them from anything, and we finally like kind of get into like, okay, there's emotional issues that need to be addressed, and maybe that's where the problems are coming from. Another thing to be mindful of, if you're working with any child under the age of 6, sometimes the way trauma shows up for them is trauma reenactment. So playing certain aspects of the trauma is how little kids actually show the symptoms, or nightmares and dreams. It doesn't have to necessarily be about the trauma, but it's just scary dreams. So that's another thing that we see with little ones. So when trauma happens, there are 5 areas that are impacted. And that's like in most people. It doesn't have to be all 5, but at least 1, 2, 3, or all 5 of these. So the first one is like safety. Safety is the number one that most people who had experienced trauma question, right? Like, am I safe, right? Can I protect myself if something bad was to happen? Can trust people that they are not going to harm me? Similarly, like trust. Who can I trust? Can I trust myself? Can I trust my judgment? Can I trust the world around me? Some of the things that contribute to these challenges also is like what the person was told as a child, where they told that the world is good, you can trust people, or were they told the world is evil? Because if they were told the world is good and safe and is trustworthy and something bad happens to them, then it becomes like they start questioning, well, the world was supposed to be good and people were supposed to be trustworthy. So why this bad thing happened to me? And they try to find like a reason for why this happened. Versus if a person was told the world is evil and you shouldn't trust anybody, and then something bad happens to them, then it's a confirmation of the already belief that was there. So they get to self-blame of like, I'm so this, why did I do this? I knew to not trust people. Why did I allow someone to get closer to me? So then that becomes what is it called? Self-blame and guilt of the decisions that they made, which can lead to like difficulty with decision making. As power and control, like what do I have power over? Self-esteem, like am I good enough? Am I worthy of this or that? So intimacy could be, who can I trust? Who can I be vulnerable with? Or can I be vulnerable with people? Are my words going to be used against me? What is that going to look like? So all that are some things that surface when a person experiences trauma, and we'll get a little bit into this, but like kind of working on building these 5 areas are so important when we are addressing trauma. So from there, we are looking into attachment, right? So a person who obviously had safety concerns, a person who had trust issues, and again, it depends on like how early we're talking about. So when we talk about attachment, it's early childhood experience. Somebody's needs not being met at early childhood, like as an infant, it can start with. So or receiving inconsistency caregiving. So an example could be, actually there's a kid video that I can show you later, but a child crying and mother not comforting them. So when a child cries, early on, the first year of the child dependent on parents. So if the child is crying and mom is not comforting them, that child can learn to self-comfort, right? Like they'll cry for a while, but when they notice that nobody's giving them attention, then they might have to learn to self-soothe. But right there and then, the message that's being sent is you cannot trust. Like, the people that are close to you that's supposed to take care of you are not taking care of you. So, and they could develop avoidant attachment at that time, which is like kind of not investing in emotional connections with other people for self-preservation. So that girl that we talked about who's like, I'm going to be alone by myself, I'm fine, I don't need anybody in my life, that's an example of like avoidance. There's an anxious attachment. So a lot of the refugee youth, we see avoidant and anxious attachment are very common. Anxious attachment is when a person has a fear of abandonment, a lot of insecurity, uh, issues with boundaries, and also like kind of codependency times. So those are the two that are very, very common. We can also sometimes see the disorganized, which is kind of based on that's consequences of childhood trauma. As a result of childhood trauma, a person can have like this mixed caregiver not meeting their needs and or not knowing when their needs would be met. So like there's just like uncertainty about where they at in terms of that relationship. And of course, we always strive for reaching some type of secure attachment. These are also some signs of attachment issues. So difficulty trusting people and building relationships, difficulty in school, difficulty controlling emotions or regulating their own emotions, self-esteem challenges, failing to seek support or assistance. So again, like people with avoidance, right? Like I can do it by myself. I don't need anybody kind of attitude. And they struggle on their own. I do want to say those people are, it's not that they don't want anybody, they scared. Like it's fear-based, and that's what's keeping them locked in their own space. Of course, lack of affection, not liking to be touched or hugged or anything like that, poor impulse control and self-destructive behavior. So I want to, like, if you think back a little bit, just looking at these symptoms and then how the brain gets impacted as a result of the traumatic experiences. And I know some of the things that we said was like difficulty regulating, like the prefrontal cortex regulates emotions. So when too much stress is happening to that part of the brain, then it kind of slows down. So it's not able to function properly. It's not able to rationalize things. I want you to think of those and think about the ADHD symptoms that you might see with some of those children. A lot of the things that you will see is resemblement. So attachment, trauma, and ADHD have a lot in common. And sometimes we see a lot of like some refugee kids being diagnosed with ADHD when in reality is a trauma symptom. So kind of being, I guess, mindful of kind of how differentiating a little bit or how we differentiate. And I know that's a psychiatrist or psychologist who's doing the evaluations responsibility, but sometimes it's very helpful also if they have more background information. It helps with the diagnosing them a little bit more correctly, so we're not like over medicating children who are just like carrying a load of trauma by misdiagnosing. All right, we are kind of reaching toward the end. I do want to talk a little bit about trauma-informed care, and what that actually just means is it's an approach that focuses on catering to creating a safe place, focuses on creating a safe and supportive environment for the individual. So how do we do that? I think it's helpful to understand complex trauma and how trauma shows up in a person's body and their behavior, recognizing what the signs of trauma look like and the the triggers that a person might be experiencing. So once we understand those, then we can focus on, creating that safe place and building trust. So safety, obviously having a welcoming space, a place that's free of the triggers that might trigger that child. Place that feels physically and emotionally safe is important. Uh, Asking the child what safety looks like for you. How can we make you comfortable, right? Because a lot of times we caregivers, we want to care, we want to take care of that child and everything they need, but they also, even though they are children, they know what's also what they need, right? And it's really important that we give the person what they need. So it's like when you think about it, it's like the love language, right? If your partner wants words of affirmation and you keep giving them gifts, that doesn't add up and they're still not satisfied. But if we know what they need and we giving them what they need, it creates that sense of safety. Trust is also really, really important. And a lot of the youth that you are probably working with had experienced situations and, being in environments where they couldn't trust people, where they were told one thing and then it wasn't done, where people changed, kind of their words depending on the day or the hour. So being honest and transparent, even when things are hard, sometimes to protect a child, we might feel like, oh, we want to withhold certain information, but these kids are very resilient. So it's really important that we are honest with them, but also let them know that we are also here for you to support you, but we want you to know. I know that example that I gave earlier about the young man that I worked with had a serious trust issue, and it showed up in so many ways where it's like, even like one day got somebody took him to the Secretary of State for Michigan ID, and he was just his luck. The system was down, and he couldn't believe it that the system was down. Like, he threw a fit because he was told the system was down, and he said, "That's not true. You just don't want to give me the Michigan ID." So, but they had that kind of stuff where things were told and it wasn't true. So being clear and calm and consistent is really important with this population, and making sure that sometimes there will be times when um, there will be, like, especially for, like, I think this happens more in like foster parents, where it might be difficult to get to a child with something that you want them to do, or something that you're trying to convince them of. And it's important that when that happens also we stay calm and communicate what is it look like when we, like, what should we do when we cannot, when it feels like we are not getting anywhere, right? Because, like, my thing is, like, I like to take a time off. I'm like, okay, I'm gonna take a break, we'll circle back later. But if that child doesn't know that I'm planning to just take a break and circle back to this conversation later, they might look at it as an, you upset with them, maybe you will send them away, or you abandoning them. So again, depending on their experience, that could cause a reason, could be a reason for dysregulation. So if we communicate, let them know, hey, how, when we are not able to get to the goal that we're trying to reach, what should we do? How do we communicate? When I leave, or when I say I'm going to take a break, does not mean I'm abandoning you. It just means that I need to sleep on it tonight, that we think, and then see how else can we approach it that's different. And then healthy coping skills. So I think when I kind of touched base on this. So how do we communicate properly? How do we role model managing stress and for that child? Because again, there's a lot of skills that they don't have, and they are looking at that case manager, foster care provider, to role model for them how to navigate difficulties and challenging situations. And the more you model correctly, the more they will pick up, and that's the skills that they actually will use as they become adults. So this is a really good time and an opportunity to just role model appropriate behaviors and appropriate negotiation skills. And the last thing I wanted to talk about is self-care. So you are all here because you care. You care about this population you work with, you care about the job you do, and caring about your well-being is really, really important, because this is a hard job. The job that you do every day is a difficult job, and it takes a special person to do it. But in order for that special person to continue doing the job, we all have a responsibility to make sure that that person is taking care of themselves, right? So this is the self-care wheel, which is kind of like the 6 important parts of a person's well-being. So it's really important to kind of cater to those areas of your life that are important to you in order for you to be a well-balanced person. Self-awareness is really important. So what do you have capacity for, right? Like, if you have 2 or 3 kids in your caseload that are very challenging, it is important that you're able to say, hey, I need to pause. No more case assignments, right? I need to figure out these kids first, and then go from there. So hopefully communicating with your supervisor, that you need a break for a minute until you figure things out is important. Connecting with other people. Again, having support is important, whether that's coming from a colleague, a supervisor, whomever it's coming from. But when you have a difficulty meeting with a child, or a conflict as a foster parent, like there's a challenge with that child, it is important that you reach out to somebody who is able to hold the space for you, who's able to listen and able to validate that it is really hard, it's challenging, because sometimes that's all we need. We just need somebody to hear us and validate the fact that this child is struggling and I don't know what to do now, right? Setting healthy boundaries is also important, like being able to, communicate with the person and saying, hey, like, for example, I work between this and this. You can reach out to me these hours if I'm not available, or after hours, these are the people that you reach out to. Kind of having a clear guidelines of the expectations and the things that you can do for that child, because there are still things that you cannot do. We're not miracle workers, but being upfront and honest about the things that you cannot do, and teaching them to kind of follow that guideline, it's very helpful. Obviously, maintaining social relationships is important, and hobbies. You are a human. You have to have connections in life and people to lean on. You have to fill your cup, right? Like at the end of the day, we're talking about you gotta fill your cup, because we cannot pour from an empty cup. So whatever that means, whatever fills your cup is what you should do, and make sure that you create a time and prioritize your well-being. Because again, losing our care providers is the worst thing that could happen to us. We can't afford that, and the refugee population need people that actually care about them. So please take care of yourself. Thank you so much. I can take some questions if anybody has a question or a comment, or yeah, I'm gonna stop sharing now.
Thank you so much, Ikram, for that great presentation. It was so great to hear about all the science of trauma, and then also really important uplifting that self-care piece at the end, because it's not just about the youth that we serve, but also taking care of ourselves. So we have a question here from Mark and Ina Corell. What is a good way to restore trust and healthy relationships where we've made a mistake with the youth?